Socialite murdered in 1991. High Society Scandal. Chapter 1. The Party. The October rain fell softly on Hartfield Estate that evening, creating a gentle symphony against the Georgian windows of the grand manor house. Victoria Ashford-Pembroke stood in the drawing room, her emerald gown catching the light from the crystal chandeliers, as she greeted guests arriving for the annual Oxfordshire Children's Foundation charity gala. At 32 years old, she was the epitome of British aristocratic grace. Blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, pearls adorning her neck, and a smile that had graced the society pages of Country Life and Tatler for over a decade. "Darling, you look absolutely radiant," Diana Hartwell said, kissing Victoria on both cheeks. Diana, a former model who had married into old money, had been Victoria's closest friend since their days at Cheltenham Ladies' College. Her red dress turned heads as she entered, her dark hair falling in waves over her bare shoulders. "You're too kind, Di," Victoria replied, her voice carrying that particular upper-class English lilt that spoke of boarding schools and debutante balls. "I'm so glad you could make it." Edward was worried the weather might keep people away. Edward Ashford-Pembroke appeared at his wife's side, a glass of champagne in each hand. At 43, he carried himself with the confidence of someone born into privilege, tall, with graying temples, and the kind of tan that came from yacht clubs in the Mediterranean. He handed Victoria one of the glasses. "The turnout is excellent," he said, surveying the growing crowd in the ballroom beyond. "Father will be pleased. We've already raised over £50,000, and the auction hasn't even started." Sir Charles Ashford-Pembroke, Edward's father, held court near the fireplace in the library. At 71, he remained a formidable presence, a former member of Parliament with connections that stretched through every corridor of power in Westminster. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him in a Queen Anne chair, her steel-grey hair perfectly coiffed, her expression one of practiced civility. The guest list read like a who's who of British society. There were members of Parliament, High Court judges, banking executives from the City of London, and several distant relatives of the royal family. The string quartet played Mozart as white-gloved waiters circulated with trays of canapés and vintage champagne. It was the kind of gathering that defined English upper-class life, refined, exclusive, and utterly proper on the surface. Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and accepting compliments. She had married into the Ashford-Pembroke family 10 years earlier, bringing with her a considerable fortune from her own family's shipping business. The marriage had been seen as a perfect union of two old families, though those who knew them well understood it was more arrangement than romance. "Mrs. Ashford-Pembroke, might I have a word?" James Whitmore, the family's longtime solicitor, appeared at her elbow. He was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetually worried expression. "Of course, James," Victoria said, excusing herself from a conversation about fox hunting with the local master of hounds. Whitmore led her to a quiet corner near the conservatory doors. "It's about the matter we discussed last week," he said in a low voice. "The documentation you requested regarding the trust arrangements. I've completed the preliminary review, and there are some irregularities that need addressing." Victoria's smile never faltered, but her green eyes hardened slightly. "We'll discuss this on Monday in your office. Tonight is for the charity, nothing more." "Of course," Whitmore said, though his discomfort was evident. "I simply thought you should know that." "Monday, James," Victoria repeated firmly. She touched his arm gently. "Now, do have some champagne. You look like you need it." As the evening progressed, dinner was served in the formal dining room. The long mahogany table, which could seat 30 guests, groaned under the weight of Georgian silver and Wedgwood china. Victoria had been seated at the head of the table, with Edward at the opposite end. Diana sat to Victoria's right, while a prominent Conservative MP occupied the chair to her left. The meal consisted of 7 courses, prepared by a chef brought in especially from London. There was smoked salmon from Scotland, pheasant shot on the estate itself, and a dessert of raspberry pavlova that drew appreciative murmurs from the guests. Wine flowed freely, a Pouligny Montrachet with the fish, a Chateau Margaux with the game, and a sweet sauternes with dessert. "Victoria, darling, you must tell me your secret," Lady Cynthia Worthington said from across the table. She was a woman in her 60s, dripping with diamonds and malice in equal measure. "You look positively glowing. Is there news you haven't shared?" Victoria laughed, a musical sound that carried down the table. "No announcements tonight, Cynthia. Just good lighting and excellent champagne. The comment drew polite laughter, but those paying attention noticed the brief glance Victoria exchanged with Edward, something tense and unspoken passing between them. After dinner, guests moved back to the ballroom for the auction. Items up for bid included a week at a villa in Tuscany, a guided tour of the Houses of Parliament, signed first editions of books by various prominent authors, and a string of pearls that had supposedly belonged to a Victorian duchess. Sir Charles served as auctioneer, his booming voice and natural authority driving the bidding higher and higher. Victoria excused herself around 9:30, complaining of a slight headache. Several guests saw her go upstairs, her hand trailing along the banister as she climbed to the second floor, where the family's private quarters were located. "Too much champagne, I expect," Diana said to another guest, watching her friend ascend the stairs. Victoria never could pace herself at these events. An hour later, Edward went looking for his wife. The auction had concluded, and several guests were preparing to leave. He wanted Victoria to say her goodbyes, to play her role as the gracious hostess until the very end. He found her in their bedroom, lying across the bed still in her emerald gown. At first, he thought she had simply fallen asleep, but when he approached and touched her shoulder, he recoiled. Her skin was cold, her eyes open and staring at nothing, and foam had dried at the corners of her mouth. Edward's shout brought guests running. Diana reached the bedroom first, taking one look at her friend's contorted face and screaming. Sir Charles arrived moments later, his commanding presence briefly filling the doorway before he took in the scene, and his face went ashen. "Get everyone out," he ordered. "Whitmore, telephone the police. Margaret, take the guests to the library and keep them calm." Dr. Henry Thornton, a guest who practiced at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, pushed through the gathering crowd at the bedroom door. He knelt beside Victoria, checking for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find, noting the fixed pupils and the particular smell, faint but distinct, that clung to her lips. "She's gone," he said quietly. "And unless I'm very much mistaken, this wasn't natural causes. Look at the lividity, the foam residue. This has the appearance of poisoning." The words hung in the air like smoke. Poisoning. At a charity gala, in one of Oxfordshire's most prestigious homes, with over 50 members of Britain's elite in attendance. The Thames Valley Police arrived 20 minutes later, led by Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan. He was a man in his late 40s, with the weathered face of someone who had worked his way up through the ranks without the benefit of connections or private education. He took in the scene with practiced eyes, the expensive furnishings, the nervous aristocrats gathered in small groups downstairs, and the body of a beautiful woman, lying on a bed, worth more than his annual salary. "Right then," Brennan said to his sergeant, a young man named Peter Collins, "let's establish who was here, what they drank, what they ate, and who had access to this room. And someone get the pathologist here immediately. We'll need toxicology done as quickly as possible." What Detective Inspector Brennan didn't know yet was that this would become the most frustrating case of his career, that the dead woman on the bed held secrets powerful enough to threaten some of the most influential families in England, and that solving her murder would require navigating a maze of legal obstacles, political pressure, and the protective walls that the British upper class had been building around themselves for centuries. The investigation into Victoria Ashford-Pembroke's death was about to begin, but the truth would prove far more elusive than anyone imagined. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. The Hartfield estate became a crime scene in the early hours of October 20th, 1991. Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan stood in the grand entrance hall, watching as scene of crime officers in white protective suits moved through the manor house like ghosts. The remaining party guests had been corralled into 3 separate rooms: the library, the drawing room, and the billiard room, segregated to prevent them from coordinating their stories. Dr. Simon Blackwell, the Home Office pathologist, emerged from the bedroom just after midnight. He was a meticulous man in his 60s, with a reputation for thoroughness that had made him the preferred expert in high-profile cases. He pulled off his latex gloves as he descended the stairs. "Preliminary observations suggest acute poisoning," Blackwell told Brennan. "The foam around the mouth, the facial expression, the discoloration of the extremities, all consistent with arsenical poisoning. But I'll need to complete the postmortem and run full toxicology to be certain. The stomach contents will be particularly telling." "How long does arsenic take to work?" Brennan asked, pulling out his notebook. "Depends on the dose and form," Blackwell replied. "With a large enough dose of arsenic trioxide, symptoms can appear within 30 minutes. Death can occur anywhere from 1 to 4 hours later. Given that witnesses report she went upstairs at approximately 9:30 and was found at 10:40, the timeline fits. She likely ingested it sometime between 8 and 9 o'clock. During dinner, Brennan said. Most likely, yes, though it could have been in a drink afterward. Brennan nodded slowly, his mind already working through the implications. How difficult is it to obtain arsenic these days? More difficult than in Victorian times, certainly, but not impossible. It's still used in some industrial applications, certain pesticides, and some specialized manufacturing processes. Anyone with the right connections or knowledge could acquire it. The detective made a note. How quickly can you complete the post-mortem? I'll begin first thing in the morning. Full toxicology results will take at least a week, possibly 2. But I should be able to confirm or rule out arsenic poisoning within 48 hours with the preliminary tests. As Blackwell departed for the mortuary, Brennan turned his attention to the guests. Sergeant Collins had compiled a preliminary list. 53 people had attended the charity gala, not including the household staff of 8 who had been working that evening. That's 61 people who were in the house when she died, Collins said, running his finger down the list. And that's not counting the catering staff. Another dozen servers and kitchen workers brought in from an agency in Oxford. Brennan rubbed his temples. 73 potential suspects or witnesses, and I'm willing to bet half of them have titles, and the other half know someone who does. He wasn't wrong. The guest list included 2 members of Parliament, a High Court judge, the Lord Lieutenant of Oxfordshire, several banking executives, a prominent barrister, and enough aristocracy to fill a Burke's peerage. These weren't people accustomed to being treated as suspects in a murder investigation. Sir Charles Ashford-Pembroke made that abundantly clear when Brennan requested to interview him first. They sat in the study, a room lined with leather-bound books and hunting trophies. Sir Charles occupied a wing-back chair as if it were a throne, while James Whitmore, the family solicitor, sat beside him like a protective guard dog. Detective Inspector, Sir Charles began, his voice carrying the tone of someone used to addressing Parliament. I appreciate that you have a job to do, but I must insist that you conduct this investigation with appropriate discretion. My daughter-in-law has died under tragic circumstances, and my family deserves privacy in this difficult time. Someone poisoned your daughter-in-law in your home during a party attended by dozens of people, Brennan replied evenly. Privacy ceased to be an option the moment that happened. Whitmore cleared his throat. Inspector, Sir Charles is naturally distressed. What he means is that we hope you'll be sensitive to the family's position. Many of the guests here tonight are prominent individuals who cannot afford to have their names dragged through the tabloids in connection with a sordid murder investigation. Sordid. Brennan raised an eyebrow. A young woman is dead. Murdered, most likely. That's not sordid, Mr. Whitmore. That's a serious crime, and I intend to investigate it properly, regardless of who might find it inconvenient. Sir Charles's eyes narrowed. Don't take that tone with me, Inspector. I have friends in the Home Office who will expect me to do my job. Brennan interrupted. Now, we can do this the easy way, with everyone cooperating fully, or we can do it the difficult way. But make no mistake, I will question everyone who is in this house tonight. I will search any rooms I deem necessary, and I will pursue any leads that emerge. Is that understood? The room fell silent. Whitmore whispered something to Sir Charles, who finally gave a curt nod. Very well, the older man said stiffly. What do you want to know? The interview lasted nearly an hour. Sir Charles described the evening's events, the guest list, the dinner arrangements. He had been in the library for most of the evening, he claimed, entertaining several prominent guests. During dinner, he had sat near the middle of the table, with clear views of both Victoria and Edward. Did you notice anything unusual about your daughter-in-law's behavior? Brennan asked. Victoria was her usual self, Sir Charles replied. Charming, gracious, playing the perfect hostess. Though what? She seemed somewhat distracted. Several times during dinner I noticed her staring at Edward with a rather intense expression. I assumed they had quarreled before the party. Not uncommon in any marriage. Did they quarrel often? Whitmore interjected. I don't see how that's relevant to... Let me decide what's relevant, Brennan said sharply. He turned back to Sir Charles. Did they? No more than any couple, Sir Charles said carefully. Edward and Victoria had their disagreements, of course, but nothing serious. Certainly nothing that would lead to this. Brennan made notes. What about Victoria's relationship with other family members? Your wife? The household staff? Margaret and Victoria got along well enough. My wife found her daughter-in-law somewhat too modern in her views, but they maintained civility. As for the staff, Victoria was a fair employer, perhaps a bit demanding, but nothing unusual for someone of her position. And the guests? Any conflicts or tensions with anyone who attended tonight? Sir Charles hesitated, and in that hesitation, Brennan sensed something important. Sir Charles? Victoria could be sharp-tongued at times, the older man finally said. She had strong opinions and wasn't always diplomatic in expressing them. I know she had a falling out with Lady Cynthia Worthington last year over some charity committee matter, and there were rumors of tensions with Diana Hartwell, though they appeared friendly enough tonight. What kind of tensions? Gossip, mostly. Something about Diana's husband and a business deal that went sour. But you'd have to ask Diana herself. I don't involve myself in women's squabbles. Brennan continued questioning Sir Charles for another 30 minutes, establishing his timeline, his observations, his knowledge of the household routine. By the time he finished, it was nearly 2 a.m. Edward Ashford-Pembroke was interviewed next, in the same study. He looked haggard, his tie loosened, his earlier polish completely gone. He accepted Brennan's condolences with a nod and answered questions in a flat, emotionless voice. We married 10 years ago, Edward said. July 14, 1981. Westminster Abbey, small ceremony, just family and close friends. Were you happily married? Edward's jaw tightened. What kind of question is that? A standard one in a murder investigation, Mr. Ashford-Pembroke. Spouses are always persons of interest. We had a normal marriage, some ups and downs like any couple, but I loved my wife, Inspector, and I certainly didn't poison her. Brennan noted the defensive tone but pressed on. Where were you when she went upstairs? In the ballroom, watching the auction. I was bidding on a painting, a Turner watercolor. Won it for £8,000. His voice caught. Victoria would have liked it. She loved Turner. Did you leave the ballroom at any point after she went upstairs? No, I was there the entire time. At least 20 people can confirm that. And during dinner? You sat at the opposite end of the table from your wife. The seating chart, Edward explained. Victoria always arranged it that way for formal dinners. The host and hostess sit at opposite ends. It's traditional. Did you see anyone approach your wife's glass or plate during the meal? Edward thought for a moment. The servers, of course. They were constantly refilling wine glasses and bringing courses. But other than that, no, I don't think so. Though I wasn't watching her every moment. What about after dinner? In the period before she went upstairs. We were all mingling in the ballroom. Victoria had a glass of champagne. She was talking to several people. Diana, certainly. And I think Lady Worthington. And perhaps the MP, Gerald Hartley. She seemed fine. Maybe a bit tired, but nothing alarming. Brennan leaned forward. Your father mentioned that you and Victoria might have argued before the party. Is that true? Edward's face flushed. Who told him that? Did you argue, Mr. Ashford-Pembroke? A long pause. Yes. Earlier in the day. It was nothing serious. What was it about? Money. Victoria wanted to make some changes to her trust arrangements. I thought it was unnecessary. We disagreed. These trust arrangements, are we talking about significant sums? Edward laughed bitterly. Victoria's family fortune is worth approximately £7 million. Yes, Inspector. We're talking about significant sums. And who inherits that fortune now? I do, as her husband, at least most of it. There are provisions for various charities, but the bulk of the estate comes to me. Brennan made careful notes. £7 million was a powerful motive for murder. When you found your wife's body, what exactly did you see? Edward's composure cracked slightly. She was lying on the bed. At first I thought she was asleep, but her eyes were open, and there was something white around her mouth, and her hand. He swallowed hard. Her hand was clenched, like she'd been in pain. Was anything in her hand? I don't think so. I didn't look closely. I just knew something was terribly wrong. The interview continued for another hour, with Brennan methodically establishing Edward's timeline, his financial situation, his knowledge of poisons, and his access to the bedroom where Victoria died. By the time he finished, dawn was breaking over the Oxfordshire countryside. Diana Hartwell was interviewed in the drawing room just after 6 a.m. Despite the hour and the circumstances, she looked remarkably composed, though her eyes were red from crying. Victoria was my best friend, Diana said, clutching a handkerchief. We've known each other since we were 14. I was her maid of honor at the wedding. I'm godmother to her niece. I can't believe she's gone. When did you last see Mrs. Ashford-Pembroke alive? Brennan asked gently. When she went upstairs. It must have been around 9:30. She said she had a headache and needed to lie down for a few minutes. I offered to go with her, but she said she'd be fine. How did she seem during dinner? Diana hesitated. Tense. Victoria was good at hiding it, but I knew her well enough to see the signs. She kept glancing at Edward, and once I caught her staring at James Whitmore with a very odd expression. Odd how? Angry, I think. Or perhaps determined. It's hard to describe. Were you aware of any problems in the Ashford-Pembroke marriage? Diana shifted in her seat. Inspector, all marriages have problems. Victoria and Edward's was no different. Was she having an affair? No. Diana's response was immediate and forceful. Victoria would never. She took her marriage vows seriously. Even if, she trailed off, even if what, Mrs. Hartwell? Even if Edward didn't always extend her the same courtesy, Diana finished quietly. This was new information. Are you saying Edward Ashford-Pembroke was unfaithful? I'm saying that Edward has always been very social, and Victoria sometimes worried about how social he was with certain women. But I have no proof of anything improper. Brennan made notes. What about Victoria's relationship with Sir Charles and Lady Margaret? Diana's expression hardened slightly. The Ashford-Pembrokes are old money, Inspector. Very old money, going back centuries. They have certain expectations about how things should be done. Victoria came from wealth too, but her family made their money in trade, shipping. To people like Sir Charles and Margaret, that makes her slightly common. No matter how many millions she brought to the marriage, were there conflicts? Constant small ones. How to run the household, which charities to support, how much time Edward spent managing the family business versus pursuing his own interests. Margaret has very firm ideas about a wife's role, and Victoria had equally firm ideas about being her own person. Did Victoria have enemies, Mrs. Hartwell? Anyone who might wish her harm? Diana was quiet for a long moment. Victoria was wealthy, beautiful, and didn't suffer fools. That combination makes enemies. But someone who would actually kill her? I can't imagine who. What about Lady Cynthia Worthington? I understand there was a conflict. Oh, that. Diana waved her hand dismissively. Cynthia is a bitter old woman who resents anyone younger and prettier than her. Victoria removed her from the chairmanship of the Children's Foundation last year because Cynthia was embezzling funds. Well, not embezzling exactly, but using donations to fund her lifestyle while claiming them as charitable expenses. Victoria exposed it, and Cynthia has hated her ever since. Brennan underlined Lady Worthington's name in his notebook. Anyone else? Victoria recently fired her secretary, Amanda Collins. Some sort of disagreement about confidential matters. Amanda was quite upset about it, and there was something going on with the business, Victoria's shipping company. She mentioned that she'd discovered some irregularities in the accounts and was planning to investigate. What kind of irregularities? She didn't give me details, just said that someone had been very clever, but not quite clever enough. She was meeting with James Whitmore about it. That's why he was here tonight. This added a new dimension to the investigation. Financial crimes often led to violence when someone was threatened with exposure. Brennan interviewed Diana for another 30 minutes, then moved on to the other guests. Lady Cynthia Worthington was defensive and hostile, insisting she had been in the dining room, and then the ballroom all evening, never alone, always in sight of multiple witnesses. James Whitmore was nervous and evasive, particularly when asked about the irregularities Victoria had discovered. The household staff were questioned one by one, each providing similar accounts of the evening's events. By noon on October 20th, a picture was beginning to emerge, though it was far from complete. Victoria Ashford-Pembroke had been a complex woman, wealthy, assertive, and caught in the middle of several brewing conflicts. She had enemies among the social elite, tensions within her marriage, and had discovered financial irregularities that someone might have wanted to keep hidden. But proving who had actually poisoned her would require much more than suspicions and motives. It would require evidence, and evidence, Brennan was beginning to realize, was going to be extremely difficult to obtain, especially once James Whitmore made a phone call to London and the full power of the Ashford-Pembroke family's legal team began to mobilize. Chapter 3. Walls of Privilege. On Monday, October 22, 1991, Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan received a phone call that would define the direction of his investigation. It came from Chief Superintendent Richard Pemberton, the head of Thames Valley Police's Major Crime Unit. Brennan, we need to talk about the Ashford-Pembroke case, Pemberton said, his tone carefully neutral. Come to my office this afternoon, 3 o'clock. Brennan arrived to find Pemberton sitting behind his desk with 2 other men. One he recognized as Commander Philip Westbrook from Scotland Yard. The other, a silver-haired man in an expensive Savile Row suit, was introduced as Nigel Harrington Smith, senior partner at Harrington Smith & Associates, one of London's most prestigious law firms. Mr. Harrington Smith represents the Ashford-Pembroke family, Pemberton explained. He's raised some concerns about the investigation. Brennan felt his stomach tighten, but kept his expression neutral. What kind of concerns? Harrington Smith spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who had never been told no in his professional life. Detective Inspector, my clients are grieving the loss of a beloved family member. They are, of course, committed to cooperating with your investigation. However, they have certain rights that must be respected. What rights would those be? Brennan asked. The right to privacy, for one. The right not to be subjected to unreasonable searches. The right to have legal representation present during questioning. Standard protections under English law. I've followed proper procedure throughout this investigation, Brennan said, looking at Pemberton. Every search has been authorized. Every interview conducted by the book. No one is questioning your professionalism, Commander Westbrook interjected. But this is a delicate situation. The Ashford-Pembroke family has deep connections throughout British society. We need to ensure that the investigation is conducted in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary scandal or embarrassment to innocent parties. A woman was murdered, Brennan said flatly. I'm not concerned with whether finding her killer might embarrass someone. Harrington Smith's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course not. But consider this, Inspector. Many of the guests at that party were prominent individuals who happened to be present when this tragedy occurred. They are witnesses, not suspects. Yet if their names appear in the press, if they're repeatedly questioned, if speculation runs wild, it could damage reputations and careers. Some of these individuals work in positions of national security. Others hold judicial appointments. Discretion isn't just about protecting feelings. It's about protecting the integrity of vital institutions. Brennan understood the game being played. What exactly are you asking for? Reasonable limitations, Harrington Smith replied. We're requesting that any further interviews with family members be scheduled in advance, with counsel present. We're asking that searches of family property be limited to areas directly relevant to the investigation. And we're insisting that any financial records you wish to examine be reviewed first by our firm to ensure that privileged or commercially sensitive information is properly redacted. That's not reasonable limitations, Brennan said, his voice rising. That's obstruction. You're trying to control what I can and cannot investigate. Pemberton held up a hand. Tom, calm down. I will not calm down, sir. This is a murder investigation. Victoria Ashford-Pembroke was poisoned in her own home during a party attended by 60-plus people. Someone in that house killed her. And I need to be able to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And you can, Harrington Smith said smoothly, within reasonable bounds. Look, Inspector, I'm not trying to prevent you from doing your job. I'm simply ensuring that my client's rights are protected. If you have specific questions for family members, we'll arrange interviews. If you need particular documents, we'll review them and provide what's relevant. But I will not allow fishing expeditions through private financial records or repeated harassment of grieving relatives. Brennan turned to Commander Westbrook. Sir, with respect, this is highly irregular. I've never had a lawyer dictate the terms of an investigation before. Westbrook sighed. Welcome to policing in the real world, Brennan. When you're dealing with powerful families, there are considerations beyond simply gathering evidence. Mr. Harrington Smith isn't asking you to stop investigating. He's asking you to be strategic about how you proceed. Strategic, Brennan repeated bitterly. Think of it this way, Pemberton said. If you push too hard too fast, the family could become completely uncooperative. They could refuse interviews entirely, force you to obtain warrants for every scrap of information, tie up the investigation in legal challenges, or you could work with Mr. Harrington Smith, get the cooperation you need, and solve this case. Your choice. It wasn't really a choice, and everyone in the room knew it. Brennan could fight the restrictions and see his investigation bogged down in legal quicksand, or he could accept the limitations and try to work within them. Fine, he said finally, but I want it on record that I'm operating under protest, and if this arrangement prevents me from solving this case, I'll make sure everyone knows why. Duly noted, Harrington Smith said, standing and extending his hand. Brennan ignored it. After the lawyer left, Pemberton leaned back in his chair. Tom, I know you're angry, but you need to understand the position we're in. The Home Secretary has personally called the Chief Constable. There's pressure from the very top to handle this delicately. Since when do we solve murders delicately? Brennan demanded. Since always. When the victim and suspects are from the upper classes, Commander Westbrook said bluntly. You think this is the first time wealth and power have complicated an investigation? This is how the system works. The rich protect their own. That doesn't make it right. No, Westbrook agreed, but it makes it reality. Brennan returned to his incident room at Thames Valley Police Headquarters in Oxford feeling defeated and frustrated. Sergeant Collins was waiting with the preliminary forensic reports. Dr. Blackwell confirmed arsenic poisoning, Collins said. High concentration of arsenic trioxide in the stomach contents and tissue samples. The amount was massive. Whoever did this wanted to make absolutely certain she died. How massive? Enough to kill a horse, according to Blackwell. Victoria probably started feeling symptoms within 20 minutes of ingestion. Nausea, stomach pain, vomiting. The dose was so high that death would have been inevitable within 2 to 3 hours. Brennan studied the report. So she definitely ingested it between 8 and 9 o'clock. Most likely during dinner or shortly after. That's what Blackwell thinks. He found partially digested food in her stomach. Pheasant, vegetables, some kind of sauce. The arsenic was mixed throughout the stomach contents, suggesting it was consumed with the meal. In her food or in her drink? Impossible to say definitively, but Blackwell notes that arsenic trioxide is a white powder that dissolves reasonably well in wine. It would be easier to conceal in red wine than in food, where it might affect the texture or appearance. Brennan pulled out the seating chart from the dinner party. Victoria had been at the head of the table, with Diana Hartwell to her right and Gerald Hartley, the MP, to her left. Directly across from her, about 8 feet away, sat Lady Cynthia Worthington, who had access to her wineglass during dinner, he muttered, studying the diagram. Collins had already thought about this. The servers, obviously. They were constantly refilling glasses. But also anyone sitting near her who could have reached across when attention was elsewhere. It was a formal dinner with multiple courses. People were talking, eating, looking at their own plates. Someone could have slipped something into her glass without being noticed. What about the wine itself? Could the entire bottle have been poisoned? We tested all the remaining wine from the evening. Every bottle came back clean. So either the poisoner only contaminated Victoria's glass, or they disposed of the poisoned bottle afterward. Brennan tapped his pen against the desk. Walk me through the dinner service. How did it work? Collins consulted his notes from interviewing the catering staff. There were 6 servers working the dining room. Each server was responsible for a section of the table. A woman named Sarah Jennings was assigned to the head of the table, which meant she served Victoria directly. She says she poured Victoria's wine 3 times during the meal. Once at the beginning with the first course, once with the main course, and once with dessert. Did Sarah Jennings have any connection to Victoria? None that we found. She's a 43-year-old woman from Headington, been working for the catering company for 6 years. No criminal record, no obvious motive. She says she barely knew who Victoria was before that night. What about the other servers? Same story. They're all professional catering staff with no apparent connection to the family. We've done background checks on all of them. Nothing suspicious. Brennan frowned. So either one of the servers is an incredibly skilled liar, or someone else poisoned Victoria's wine. Someone sitting at the table, Collins said. Someone sitting at the table, Brennan agreed. The problem was proving it. The dinner had been crowded, chaotic, with people talking and moving about. The lighting had been elegant but not bright. Candles and dimmed chandeliers creating atmosphere. And the guests had all been drinking, which meant their memories of specific moments were unreliable at best. Brennan spent the next 3 days re-interviewing everyone who had sat near Victoria during dinner. Diana Hartwell insisted she had been focused on her own meal and conversation with the person on her other side. Gerald Hartley, the MP, said he had been discussing parliamentary matters with Victoria and hadn't noticed anyone approaching her glass. Lady Cynthia Worthington claimed she had been too far away to see anything clearly. The problem was that all of them had alibis confirmed by multiple witnesses for the rest of the evening. Diana had been in the ballroom constantly after dinner, surrounded by friends. Gerald Hartley had been part of a group discussing politics in the library. Lady Worthington had been playing bridge in the drawing room with 3 other women who swore she never left the table. Edward Ashford-Pembroke had been watching the auction, standing near the front of the ballroom where dozens of people saw him. Sir Charles had been conducting the auction itself. Margaret had been sitting with a group of older ladies, discussing their gardens and their grandchildren. Everyone had been somewhere, doing something, seen by someone else. It was as if the murder had been committed by a ghost. On Thursday, October 24th, Brennan attempted to access Victoria's financial records. This was where Nigel Harrington Smith's restrictions became most problematic. "I need to see the trust documents," Brennan told Whitmore during a scheduled interview at the solicitor's office. "Victoria's financial arrangements, the beneficiaries, any recent changes." Whitmore glanced at Harrington Smith, who had insisted on being present for all interviews with the family and their legal representatives. "Inspector, those documents contain highly sensitive information," Harrington Smith said. "Details about the Ashford-Pembroke family's assets, business relationships, tax strategies. I'm willing to provide you with a summary of the relevant information, but I cannot allow you unfettered access to confidential financial records." "A woman discovered irregularities in those records," Brennan argued. "Days later, she was murdered." "I need to see what she saw." "What irregularities?" Harrington Smith asked. "Do you have any evidence that such irregularities exist, or are you relying on second-hand gossip?" Brennan hesitated. His only source was Diana Hartwell, who had heard it from Victoria. There was no documentation, no proof. Victoria told her friend that she had found something wrong in the accounts, Brennan said. She was meeting with Mr. Whitmore to discuss it. Whitmore cleared his throat nervously. Victoria did request a meeting to review certain trust provisions, but she hadn't provided specifics about what concerned her. The meeting was scheduled for the Monday after the party. Obviously, it never took place. What provisions was she interested in reviewing? Another glance at Harrington Smith. The distribution schedule. Who inherits what, and under what conditions? Why would that concern her? "I don't know," Whitmore said. She simply said she wanted to understand the full picture before making any decisions. Decisions about what? She didn't say. Brennan felt like he was interrogating shadows. Every answer led to more questions, and every question hit a wall of attorney-client privilege, confidentiality, or simply, "I don't know." He tried a different approach. "Mr. Whitmore, in your professional opinion, was there anything unusual about Victoria's financial situation?" Whitmore considered this carefully. Victoria was a wealthy woman in her own right. Her family's shipping business had been very successful. When she married Edward, her assets were placed in a trust designed to protect them, standard practice for someone of her wealth. And Edward couldn't access those assets? Not directly, no. But as her husband, he benefited from them. They lived in luxury, traveled extensively, maintained multiple properties. The trust paid for all of that. And now that she's dead? Now the trust transfers to Edward, with certain provisions for charity and other beneficiaries. It's all perfectly standard. £7 million is perfectly standard? Brennan asked dryly. "For this family, yes," Harrington Smith intervened. "Inspector, I think we've established that there's nothing irregular about the financial arrangements. Unless you have specific evidence of impropriety, I must ask that we conclude this line of questioning." Brennan wanted to argue, but he knew it was pointless. He had no leverage, no hard evidence, nothing that would justify forcing access to the records. Over the following week, the investigation began to stall. Every avenue Brennan pursued ran into obstacles. Attempts to re-interview Edward Ashford-Pembroke were delayed by scheduling conflicts. Requests for household financial records were met with claims that they were being compiled, but would take weeks to fully organize. Questions about Victoria's personal papers were answered with vague statements that everything was being reviewed by counsel. Meanwhile, the media had gotten wind of the case. Headlines in the tabloids screamed about "murder among the upper class" and "poison at the manor house." The broadsheets were more restrained but equally fascinated. The Times ran a lengthy article about Victoria's family history and her marriage into the Ashford-Pembroke dynasty. The Telegraph speculated about political implications, given the number of MPs and government officials who had attended the party. The publicity made everyone even less cooperative. Guests who had been merely reluctant to talk were now refusing interviews entirely, citing media harassment and privacy concerns. Harrington Smith filed formal complaints about leaked information, though Brennan's team had been scrupulously careful about not speaking to journalists. Dr. Blackwell's final toxicology report arrived on November 5th. It confirmed everything in the preliminary analysis: massive arsenic poisoning, death occurring between 2 and 3 hours after ingestion, no other contributing factors. The concentration of arsenic was so high that it overwhelmed her system, Blackwell told Brennan during a meeting at the pathologist's office. This wasn't a subtle poisoning. This was meant to be fast and certain, which suggests what about the killer? Either someone with access to a large quantity of arsenic, or someone who didn't care about the dose being traceable. A smaller amount would have been just as lethal eventually, but might have looked more like natural causes. This amount? It's clearly murder. Could a layperson have known the right dose? Blackwell shrugged. Arsenic has been a murder weapon for centuries. The information is readily available in libraries, in historical texts about famous poisoning cases. Anyone with reasonable intelligence and research skills could have learned what they needed to know. It was another dead end. The manner of death was clear, but it provided no direct evidence pointing to the killer. By mid-November, Brennan's superiors were pressuring him to show progress. Chief Superintendent Pemberton called him in for weekly updates that felt more like interrogations. "What do you have, Tom?" Pemberton asked during one such meeting. "It's been 4 weeks. Where are we? We know how she was killed. Arsenic in her wine during dinner. We know approximately when, but we can't identify who had the opportunity to poison her glass without being seen, and we can't establish a definitive motive for any single suspect." "What about the husband? £7 million is one hell of a motive. Edward Ashford-Pembroke benefits financially, yes, but he was visible in the ballroom during the time Victoria was dying upstairs. Multiple witnesses confirm it, and there's no evidence he was anywhere near her wine glass during dinner. He was sitting at the opposite end of a 30-foot table. Could he have had an accomplice? Possibly. But who? We've investigated everyone in that house. No one has an obvious connection to Edward that would suggest conspiracy." Pemberton rubbed his eyes. "What about this financial irregularity? Diana Hartwell said Victoria found something. The family's lawyers won't let me see the records. They claim attorney-client privilege and commercial confidentiality. I've tried to get a warrant, but the magistrate says I need more specific evidence of criminal activity before he'll authorize access to private financial documents. So we're stuck." "We're stuck," Brennan agreed bitterly. "The press is calling this the case we can't solve," Pemberton said. "The tabloids are having a field day with stories about how the rich can get away with murder. It's making us look incompetent. Then maybe the magistrate should authorize my warrant request." "Don't be naive, Tom. The Ashford-Pembrokes have more political influence than we do. If we push too hard, we'll be the ones who end up damaged." It was the most honest thing Pemberton had said in weeks, and it made Brennan want to put his fist through a wall. In early December, Nigel Harrington Smith requested a meeting with Thames Valley Police leadership. Brennan was invited to attend, along with Pemberton and Commander Westbrook from Scotland Yard. "Gentlemen," Harrington Smith began, "my clients appreciate the thoroughness of your investigation. However, after 7 weeks of intensive police work, it's clear that you've reached an impasse. No arrests have been made, no charges have been filed, and no evidence has emerged that points to any specific individual. These things take time," Brennan said. "Of course, but my clients are suffering. The family is in mourning, yet they're subjected to constant police presence, repeated interviews, and vicious media speculation. Sir Charles's health has declined under the stress. Margaret Ashford-Pembroke is being treated for anxiety. Edward is barely functioning. A woman was murdered," Brennan said again, as if repetition might make someone care. "Yes, and my clients want her killer found as much as you do. But there comes a point when an investigation does more harm than good. I'm formally requesting that you scale back active investigation into the family itself. If new evidence emerges, you can, of course, pursue it, but the constant scrutiny must end." "That's not how murder investigations work," Brennan said flatly. "It's how this one must work," Harrington Smith replied. "Unless you have specific evidence that a family member committed this crime, I must insist that you respect their rights and their grief." The meeting went on for another hour, but the outcome was predetermined. By the time it concluded, Brennan had been effectively ordered to pull back from aggressive investigation of the Ashford-Pembroke family unless and until new evidence emerged. He walked out of the meeting, feeling like he'd failed Victoria Ashford-Pembroke completely. Chapter 4: Secrets Beneath the Surface. Despite the official pressure to scale back, Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan refused to let the case die. If he couldn't directly investigate the family through official channels, he would look elsewhere, at the edges, in the shadows, at the pieces that didn't quite fit. He started with Victoria herself, building a comprehensive picture of who she had been in the months before her death. He spoke to her hairdresser, her personal trainer, the manager of the boutique where she shopped, the proprietor of the tea room where she met friends. These people weren't protected by expensive lawyers, and they had no reason to hide what they knew. A picture emerged of a woman who had been changing in the weeks before her death. Several people commented that Victoria had seemed distracted, worried about something she wouldn't discuss. Her hairdresser mentioned that Victoria had asked questions about confidentiality, whether conversations in the salon were truly private, whether anyone could overhear. She seemed paranoid. The hairdresser, a woman named Sophie, told Brennan. Not her usual self at all. Normally Victoria was so confident, so in control, but the last few times she came in, she kept looking around, like she was worried about being watched. The personal trainer reported something similar. During our session in late September, she asked me hypothetical questions about leaving England. What would I do if I wanted to start fresh somewhere else? How difficult would it be to relocate to France or Spain? I thought maybe she and Edward were having problems and she was considering a separation. Most intriguing was what Brennan learned from Jennifer Prescott, the secretary Victoria had fired 2 months before her death. Brennan tracked Jennifer down to a small flat in Reading, where she was living on unemployment benefits and growing increasingly bitter. Victoria ruined my life, Jennifer said when Brennan showed up at her door. She was in her early 30s, plain-featured and exhausted-looking. I worked for her for 3 years. I was good at my job. Then suddenly she accused me of snooping and fired me without notice. What were you supposedly snooping into? She never explained. Just said I'd violated her trust by accessing files I shouldn't have looked at. But that was ridiculous. I was her secretary. How was I supposed to do my job without accessing files? What files was she referring to? Jennifer's expression turned cagey. I don't know exactly, but I think it had something to do with the shipping company. Victoria's family business. What about the shipping company? About 2 months before she fired me, Victoria asked me to pull some financial records from the company archive. Reports from the past 5 years, detailing contracts, payments, that sort of thing. I did what she asked. A few days later, she seemed upset about something in those records. She started making phone calls to the company's accountants, asking questions I didn't fully understand. What kind of questions? About discrepancies in the books, missing payments, contracts that didn't match up with reported revenues. She was intense about it, like she'd discovered something really wrong. And then she fired you? 3 weeks later, she said I'd talked to someone about what I'd found, but I swear I didn't. The only person I mentioned anything to was my boyfriend, and that was just casual conversation over dinner. I didn't think it was a big deal. Who was your boyfriend? His name was Peter Matthews. We dated for about 6 months last year. Brennan felt a tingle of instinct. What does Peter Matthews do for a living? He's an accountant. Works for a firm in London. I don't remember which one exactly. We broke up not long after I got fired. Brennan made careful notes. Did Victoria ever say what she planned to do about the discrepancies she found? She mentioned hiring a forensic accountant to do a complete audit. She said if someone had been stealing from her family, she was going to see them prosecuted, no matter who they were. That night, Brennan sat in his small office at Thames Valley Police Headquarters, surrounded by files and photographs, trying to piece together what Victoria had discovered. The shipping company, Ashford Shipping Holdings, was a family business that Victoria had inherited from her father. It was managed by a board of directors, but Victoria had retained majority ownership and final say in all major decisions. Sergeant Collins had managed to obtain some basic public information about the company. It was profitable, with an estimated annual revenue of £15 million. It operated container ships throughout Europe and had contracts with various international clients. The board of directors includes Edward Ashford-Pembroke, Collins noted. He was appointed 3 years ago, shortly after Victoria inherited the company. Brennan looked up sharply. Edward was on the board? Still is, actually, along with 2 of Victoria's uncles and several non-family members with shipping industry experience. So Edward had access to the company's financial information. Presumably, yes. Board members would have received regular financial reports. This was exactly the kind of connection Brennan needed to pursue, but it was also exactly the kind of connection that would require accessing the financial records that Nigel Harrington Smith had put off limits. He felt the familiar frustration building. There has to be another way, he muttered. Collins thought for a moment. What about going directly to the shipping company? Victoria owned it, but it's a separate corporate entity. The family's lawyers might not be able to block access to its records. It was a good idea, but when Brennan contacted Ashford Shipping Holdings, he learned that the company's legal representation was, surprise, Harrington Smith and Associates. Requests for financial information were politely but firmly declined without a court order. Brennan tried a different approach. He identified the accountants Victoria had spoken to in the weeks before her death and requested interviews. 2 of them refused, citing client confidentiality. The third, a younger man named David Thornton, agreed to speak with Brennan, though he was clearly nervous about it. They met at a cafe in Oxford, away from the young man's office and prying eyes. "I can't tell you specific details about the company's finances," David said immediately. "That would violate confidentiality agreements." "I understand," Brennan said. "But you can tell me about Victoria's state of mind, surely. That's not confidential. That's your personal observation." David relaxed slightly. "Victoria was worried when she called me. Really worried. She said she'd been reviewing reports and had found patterns that concerned her." "What kind of patterns?" "I can't get specific, but imagine a situation where expenses are reported at one level, but actual expenditures don't match, or where contracts are recorded, but the payments flowing through don't align with what those contracts should generate. That's the kind of thing that suggests either very sloppy bookkeeping or deliberate manipulation." "And Victoria thought it was deliberate?" "She was certain of it. She told me she'd cross-referenced multiple years of data and found consistent discrepancies. Someone had been very careful, very methodical, but they'd left traces. She wanted me to recommend a forensic accountant who could do a full investigation without alerting anyone at the company." "Did you give her a recommendation?" "I gave her 3 names. I don't know if she contacted any of them before." He trailed off, looking down at his coffee. "Before she was murdered," Brennan finished for him. David nodded miserably. "When I heard what happened, I wondered if it was connected, but I didn't know who to tell, or whether I'd be violating confidentiality if I came forward." "You're doing the right thing now," Brennan assured him. "Can you give me those 3 names?" David wrote them down on a napkin. Brennan took it carefully, as if it were evidence in itself. Over the next week, Brennan contacted all 3 forensic accountants. 2 had never heard from Victoria. The third, a woman named Patricia Kellerman, confirmed that Victoria had called her in early October, just weeks before her death. She wanted a complete audit of Ashford Shipping Holdings, Patricia told Brennan over the phone. She said she had reason to believe significant funds had been diverted over a period of several years, and she wanted to know where the money had gone and who was responsible. "Did you agree to do the audit?" "We discussed it. She was going to send me preliminary documentation so I could assess the scope of work required, but I never received anything. Then I saw in the news that she'd died, and I assumed the family had decided not to pursue it." "What kind of sums are we talking about?" Brennan asked. "When she said significant funds, what did that mean?" "She estimated it could be as much as £2 million over 5 years, possibly more." Brennan let out a low whistle. £2 million was more than enough motive for murder. "If you had done the audit, how long would it have taken to identify the culprit? With full access to records? A few weeks, maybe a month. The pattern she described would leave a trail. Someone had to authorize transfers, sign documents, approve payments. In a company that size, those kinds of decisions don't happen anonymously." After hanging up, Brennan sat back and considered what he'd learned. Victoria had discovered that someone was embezzling from her company. She'd been preparing to launch an investigation that would have exposed them, and then, conveniently, she'd been poisoned before she could proceed. The question was, who had access to the company's finances and would have been exposed by Victoria's investigation? Edward Ashford-Pembroke was the obvious suspect. As a board member and Victoria's husband, he would have had both access and opportunity. But Brennan couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't quite that simple. Edward didn't seem clever enough to pull off a years-long embezzlement scheme, and he certainly didn't seem organized enough to cover his tracks as thoroughly as the accountant had described, unless he'd had help. Brennan pulled out the list of board members for Ashford Shipping Holdings. Besides Edward, there were Victoria's 2 uncles, Robert and Michael Ashford, and 4 non-family members with backgrounds in shipping and logistics. He began investigating each of them systematically. Robert Ashford, 58 years old, lived in a comfortable but not ostentatious house in Surrey. He'd worked in the family business his entire career and had a reputation for being steady and reliable. Financial checks showed nothing unusual. He lived within his means, had modest savings, and no signs of sudden wealth. Michael Ashford, 52, was a different story. He lived in an expensive penthouse in Chelsea, drove a Bentley, and was frequently photographed at high society events. But financial investigation revealed that most of his lifestyle was funded by legitimate investments and a generous salary from the shipping company. There were no suspicious transfers or unexplained deposits. The non-family board members were similarly clean, at least on the surface. All were well-compensated professionals with established careers and no apparent financial distress that would motivate. Embezzlement. Brennan was missing something. He could feel it. In mid-December, he received an unexpected call from Diana Hartwell. She sounded upset and wanted to meet in person. They arranged to meet at a quiet pub in a village outside Oxford, away from anywhere they might be recognized. Diana arrived looking haggard, her usual polish gone. She ordered a gin and tonic and drank half of it before speaking. "I've been thinking about Victoria constantly," she said. "About what happened, about what she told me in the weeks before she died. And I remembered something that might be important." Brennan leaned forward. "What is it?" "About a month before the party, Victoria and I had lunch in London. She was agitated about something, kept looking around like she thought we were being followed. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she'd discovered that someone close to her had been lying to her for years. Someone she'd trusted completely." "Did she say who?" "No, but she said it wasn't just about the money, though the money was significant. She said it was about betrayal, that this person had used their relationship with her to steal from her family, and they'd been doing it right under her nose while pretending to care about her." "Those were her exact words? Someone close to her?" "Yes. And then she said something strange. She said, 'You think you know someone?' And then you see the receipts and realize everything was a lie." The way she said receipts, it wasn't metaphorical. I think she literally meant she'd found receipts or documents that proved what was happening. "Did she say anything else?" Diana finished her drink and ordered another. She said she was going to confront this person soon, that she needed to be certain first, but once she had all the evidence, she was going to give them a choice: make full restitution and disappear from her life, or face criminal prosecution. She said she couldn't decide which option she hoped they would choose. When was this conversation? October 2nd, less than 3 weeks before she died. Brennan felt the pieces beginning to shift in his mind. Someone close to Victoria, someone who had access to her company, someone she trusted, someone who, when confronted with exposure, had chosen murder instead of either restitution or prosecution. "Diana, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think Edward was capable of killing his wife?" Diana was quiet for a long time. 6 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. Edward is weak, not vicious. He likes his comforts and his social position, but he's not violent. But now, knowing that Victoria had discovered something that threatened someone close to her, I don't know anymore. Edward had access to everything: her company, her finances, her private papers. If anyone could have been stealing from her, it would be him. But Edward is also lazy. The kind of systematic theft Victoria described requires planning, attention to detail, patience. Those aren't Edward's strengths. He's the type who would take money from a wallet left on the table, not the type who would construct an elaborate embezzlement scheme, unless someone else constructed it for him, Brennan said slowly. Someone clever, someone organized, someone who needed Edward's position and access, but provided the actual intelligence behind the scheme. Diana's eyes widened. "You think there's an accomplice?" "I think it's possible. The question is who." They talked for another hour, with Diana trying to remember every detail of her conversations with Victoria in those final weeks. By the time they parted, Brennan had a notebook full of new information and a growing theory about what had really happened at Hartfield Estate on October 19th, 1991. The next day, he received a break from an unexpected source. A junior officer going through the evidence logs noticed something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Among Victoria's personal effects taken from the bedroom was a small leather-bound diary. It had been logged and photographed, but not thoroughly examined, because it appeared to be mostly blank pages, the kind of elegant diary wealthy women bought but rarely filled in. But when the officer actually flipped through it carefully, he found that Victoria had made entries on several pages near the back, written in small, cramped handwriting quite different from her usual elegant script. They were dated throughout September and early October. Brennan read through them with increasing excitement. They weren't conventional diary entries, but rather notes to herself, observations and calculations. One entry from September 15th read, "Checked 1987 reports against bank statements. Discrepancy of $243K. No explanation in records. Asked JW about it. Claims accounting error. Will investigate. Don't believe him. JW. James Whitmore, the family solicitor." Another entry from September 28th. cross-referenced E's expense reports with actual receipts from credit cards, claims business trips that never happened. Monaco, Geneva, Milan, all personal. Who paid for those trips? Not from household accounts. E. Edward. But the most revealing entry was from October 10th, just 9 days before her death. Finally understand. Not just EJW has been facilitating everything, hiding transfers, creating false documentation. They've been working together. 1.8 million minimum, possibly more. Meeting with PK next week to get concrete evidence. Then we'll confront both. If they don't make full restitution, we'll prosecute. E may go to prison. Good. PK. Patricia Kellerman, the forensic accountant. Brennan felt a surge of triumph. This was evidence, real, concrete evidence, that Edward and James Whitmore had been embezzling from Victoria's company together, and that Victoria had discovered it and planned to expose them. He immediately sought a warrant to arrest both men for embezzlement and suspicion of murder. But when he presented his evidence to the magistrate, Nigel Harrington Smith appeared, as if summoned by some dark magic. These diary entries are inadmissible, Harrington Smith argued. They're hearsay, unsupported by any actual financial documentation. My clients cannot be arrested based on the private speculations of a dead woman written in a diary. They're her own observations, Brennan countered, based on evidence she'd gathered. Evidence you haven't seen and cannot produce, Harrington Smith shot back. Where are these bank statements she references? Where are the expense reports? Where is any documentation that supports these claims? You have allegations written in a diary, nothing more. The magistrate, a cautious man named Sir Geoffrey Pemberton, no relation to Brennan's superior, but cut from the same cloth of establishment deference, sided with Harrington Smith. Inspector, without supporting documentation, I cannot issue arrest warrants based solely on diary entries. If you can provide actual financial evidence of embezzlement, we can revisit this. But speculation, however well-intentioned, is not sufficient grounds for arrest. Brennan left the courthouse furious and defeated. He had evidence, but he couldn't access the financial records needed to support it, because those records were controlled by the very people he was trying to investigate. It was a perfect legal trap, and everyone knew it. But he wasn't finished yet. If he couldn't get the financial records through official channels, perhaps he could find Victoria's copies. She must have kept the evidence she'd gathered somewhere. The question was where. He returned to Hartfield Estate with a new warrant, this one specifically for Victoria's personal papers, her office, her private spaces. Harrington Smith tried to block it, but the diary entries gave Brennan just enough justification for the magistrate to allow a limited search. The Ashford-Pembroke family watched with cold hostility as police officers carefully searched Victoria's study, her bedroom, her private sitting room. They found letters, photographs, personal correspondence, but no financial documents, no bank statements, no expense reports, nothing that would support the allegations in her diary. They've been removed, Brennan told Sergeant Collins as they stood in Victoria's elegant study. Someone cleaned this place out before we could get here. Or she kept them somewhere else, Collins suggested. A safety deposit box, maybe? Her solicitor's office? Brennan seized on this idea. Victoria had her own solicitor, separate from the family's representation, a firm in London that had handled her father's estate. He contacted them immediately. The senior partner, a woman named Elizabeth Crane, was sympathetic but unhelpful. Mrs. Ashford-Pembroke did maintain a safety deposit box through our office. However, following her death, her husband, as her legal heir, exercised his right to access it. The contents were removed 3 days after her death. What was in it? I'm afraid I don't know. Clients' safety deposit boxes are private. We provide the facility, but we don't monitor or record the contents. Another dead end. Edward had gotten there first, and whatever evidence Victoria had compiled was now gone. Brennan felt the case slipping through his fingers like water. He had means, arsenic poisoning. He had opportunity. Edward had been at the dinner party, though his presence in the ballroom afterward complicated things. He had motive, £2 million in embezzled funds, and the threat of criminal prosecution. And he had evidence in Victoria's diary that she'd planned to expose him. But he didn't have the financial records to prove the embezzlement had actually occurred. He didn't have any physical evidence linking Edward to the arsenic. He didn't have any witnesses who saw Edward poison Victoria's wine. And Edward's lawyers could argue that the diary entries were the paranoid fantasies of an unstable woman, unsupported by any objective evidence. In late December, Brennan met with his superiors again. The meeting was brief and depressing. "We can't prosecute without evidence," Chief Superintendent Pemberton said bluntly. "The Crown Prosecution Service has reviewed everything we have, and they say it's insufficient. The case against Edward Ashford-Pembroke is circumstantial at best. He killed his wife," Brennan said flatly. "He and James Whitmore were stealing from her company. She discovered it, and they murdered her to keep it quiet." "Probably," Commander Westbrook agreed. "But probably isn't enough for a conviction. You need hard evidence, and the only hard evidence that existed has been destroyed or hidden. So what are you saying? We just give up?" "We're saying the case remains open," Pemberton said. "If new evidence emerges, we'll pursue it. But we can't justify dedicating more resources to an investigation that's going nowhere. You've done good work, Tom. Sometimes the villains win. That's the reality of policing." Brennan wanted to throw something. Instead, he stood up stiffly. "Is that what I tell Victoria's family?" "Sorry. The villains won this time?" "Victoria's family is the villains," Westbrook said quietly. "Or at least part of it is. But they have better lawyers than we have evidence, so they get away with it. That's how the world works when you're rich enough." Chapter 5. The Conspiracy Deepens. Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan refused to close the file on Victoria Ashford-Pembroke's murder, even though he'd been officially told to move on to other cases. He worked on it in his spare time, in the evenings and on weekends, becoming increasingly obsessed with finding the one piece of evidence that would break the case open. In January 1992, 3 months after Victoria's death, Brennan received an anonymous letter at his office. It was typed on plain paper with no return address, postmarked from London. The letter read, "Detective Inspector Brennan, if you want to know the truth about Victoria Ashford-Pembroke's death, investigate the Monaco trip in April 1990. Edward wasn't there for business. Look at who he met with and why. The answer is in the photographs. Someone who knew Victoria. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it." Brennan stared at the letter for a long time. Monaco, April 1990. Victoria's diary had mentioned Monaco as one of Edward's supposedly fraudulent business trips. But what photographs? And who had sent this letter? He began investigating Edward's Monaco trip. According to expense reports filed with Ashford Shipping Holdings, Edward had traveled to Monaco from April 10th to April 15th, 1990, to meet with potential clients interested in shipping contracts. The trip had been charged to the company. Flights, hotel, meals, all legitimate business expenses. But Brennan had learned to doubt everything in this case. He contacted hotels in Monaco, showing them Edward's photograph. The third hotel he called, the Hotel de Paris Monte Carlo, confirmed that Edward had indeed stayed there during those dates. But the reservation had been for 2 people, not 1. "Can you tell me who the second person was?" Brennan asked. The hotel staff apologized, but said their records from nearly 2 years ago didn't include that level of detail. However, the concierge who had been working during that period remembered something. "Mr. Ashford-Pembroke was with a young woman," the concierge said when Brennan called him directly. "Very attractive, dark hair. They were quite affectionate with each other. I assumed she was his wife, but when I mentioned something about Mrs. Ashford-Pembroke, he corrected me quickly and said she was his business associate. Do you remember anything else about her? She had a British accent, and I recall thinking it was strange that a business associate would be sharing a room with him. But it's not my place to judge the guests. A business associate, a dark-haired woman, affectionate with Edward." Brennan thought about the women who had been at the party on October 19th. Most were blonde or gray-haired society matrons, but Diana Hartwell had dark hair, and she had been Victoria's closest friend, someone who would have had intimate knowledge of Victoria's plans and movements. He dismissed the thought immediately. Diana had been genuinely devastated by Victoria's death. She'd been crying, barely functional in the days after. You couldn't fake that kind of grief, could you? Brennan began investigating Diana Hartwell more thoroughly. She was 30 years old, married to Richard Hartwell, a property developer with significant wealth. They lived in a substantial house in Notting Hill and moved in the same social circles as the Ashford-Pembrokes. Diana's background was interesting. She'd been a successful model in her early 20s, working primarily in London and Paris. She'd met Richard at a fashion show in 1986 and married him 6 months later. Her career had ended shortly after the marriage. Richard preferred his wife not to work. Financial investigation showed that Diana and Richard were comfortable but not extravagantly wealthy. Richard's property development business had suffered some setbacks in the late 80s, and there were indications that they'd been struggling to maintain their lifestyle. But there was something else. In May 1990, just 1 month after Edward's Monaco trip, Diana had received a transfer of £50,000 into her personal bank account. The source was listed as consulting fees from a company called Meridian Holdings Limited. Brennan investigated Meridian Holdings. It was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands with no apparent business activity, and one of its directors was James Whitmore. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. Edward and Diana had been having an affair. James Whitmore had been facilitating embezzlement from Victoria's company, with Edward and Diana as the beneficiaries. They'd been funneling money through shell companies, hiding it in offshore accounts, creating false documentation to cover their tracks. And when Victoria started to uncover the scheme, all three of them had conspired to murder her. But Brennan still needed proof. He needed to establish that Diana had been in Monaco with Edward. He needed to prove that the £50,000 was embezzled funds, not legitimate consulting fees. He needed evidence that connected all three conspirators to the murder itself. The photographs. The anonymous letter had mentioned photographs. Brennan returned to the Monaco hotel and asked about photographs. Did they have a hotel photographer who might have taken pictures of guests during that period? The concierge remembered that there had been a special event, a gala dinner for high-rolling guests, and a photographer had been hired to take commemorative photos. Would you still have those photographs? Brennan asked. Possibly in our archives. Let me check. 2 weeks later, Brennan received a package from Monaco. Inside were dozens of photographs from the April 1990 gala dinner, and there, in the 15th photograph, were Edward Ashford-Pembroke and Diana Hartwell, sitting at a table together, holding hands, looking at each other with unmistakable intimacy. The photograph was dated April 13th, 1990, right in the middle of Edward's supposedly solo business trip. Brennan felt triumph surge through him. This was evidence, physical, undeniable evidence, that Edward and Diana had been together in Monaco, that Edward had lied about the trip, and that Diana had been deceiving her best friend for years. He brought the photograph to Chief Superintendent Pemberton, along with the financial information about the £50,000 transfer and the shell company. This changes things, Pemberton admitted. This is evidence of an affair and financial irregularities. Combined with Victoria's diary entries, we might have enough to bring charges. But Nigel Harrington Smith had one more card to play. When Brennan sought warrants to arrest Edward, Diana, and James Whitmore, Harrington Smith appeared with a team of barristers and a thick brief of legal arguments. My clients deny all allegations, Harrington Smith said. The photograph shows two friends at a social event, nothing more. The financial transfers were legitimate business transactions. Mrs. Hartwell did consulting work for Meridian Holdings, advising on property investments. Everything was properly documented and taxed. Properly documented through a shell company designed to hide the source of funds, Brennan countered. Offshore incorporation is perfectly legal, Inspector. Many British businesses use international structures for tax efficiency. That doesn't constitute evidence of embezzlement. The legal battle dragged on for weeks. Harrington Smith filed motion after motion, challenging the admissibility of evidence, questioning the validity of warrants, demanding that various pieces of evidence be excluded. The magistrate, increasingly frustrated, but also increasingly cautious, ruled in favor of the defense more often than not. In March 1992, the Crown Prosecution Service made its final decision. There was insufficient evidence to prosecute Edward Ashford-Pembroke, Diana Hartwell, or James Whitmore for either murder or embezzlement. The diary entries are hearsay, the CPS lawyer explained to Brennan. The photograph proves an affair but not murder. The financial transfers might be suspicious, but without access to the full financial records of both Ashford Shipping Holdings and Meridian Holdings, we can't prove they constitute embezzlement. And most critically, we have no physical evidence linking any of the three suspects to the arsenic that killed Victoria. No one saw them poison her wine. No one can testify to hearing them plan the murder. It's all circumstantial, and no jury would convict on this evidence. So they get away with it, Brennan said bitterly. Unless you find more evidence, yes. I'm sorry, Inspector. I know you've worked hard on this case, but the legal system requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, and we simply don't have that here. Brennan returned to his office and sat in silence for a long time. Victoria Ashford-Pembroke had been murdered by people she trusted, her husband, her best friend, and her family's lawyer. They'd stolen from her, betrayed her, and then killed her when she discovered the truth. And they were going to walk free because they had enough money to hire lawyers who could tie the investigation in knots. It was the most profound failure of his career, but the case wasn't completely over. Someone had sent him the anonymous letter about the Monaco photographs. Someone out there knew the truth and wanted it exposed. The question was who and why they hadn't come forward with more evidence. Brennan spent the next several months trying to identify the sender of the anonymous letter. He had the envelope analyzed for fingerprints. None found. He checked the postmark and tried to identify where in London it might have been mailed from. Too generic to narrow down. He showed the letter to handwriting experts, but since it was typed, there was nothing to analyze. Whoever had sent it had been careful to remain anonymous. In June 1992, 8 months after Victoria's death, Brennan received a second anonymous letter. This one was even more cryptic. Detective Inspector Brennan, you're looking at the wrong financial records. The embezzlement from Ashford Shipping was small compared to the main scheme. Check Victoria's personal trust. Check who had power of attorney. Check the transfers made in the week after her death, before anyone was paying attention. That's where the real money went. Follow the money to Switzerland. Switzerland. Power of attorney. Transfers made after Victoria's death. Brennan immediately began investigating Victoria's personal trust, the £7 million fortune she'd inherited from her father. According to the trust documents, Victoria had full control of the assets during her lifetime. Upon her death, the assets would transfer to her designated beneficiaries. But who were those beneficiaries? The family's lawyers had refused to disclose that information, citing privacy concerns. Brennan went back to James Whitmore, this time with a warrant specifically demanding information about Victoria's trust. Whitmore, looking increasingly haggard, finally produced a copy of the trust document. The primary beneficiary was Edward Ashford-Pembroke, as expected. He would receive approximately £5 million. Various charities would receive another $1 million, and the remaining $1 million was designated for Diana Hartwell, described in the trust as "my dearest friend and confidant." £1 million to Diana Hartwell. Brennan felt his pulse quicken. This was motive. Powerful motive. Diana wasn't just helping Edward embezzle funds. She stood to inherit a fortune when Victoria died. When was this trust provision created? Brennan demanded. Whitmore checked his files. The original trust was established in 1986 when Victoria's father died, but it was amended in January 1990 to add Mrs. Hartwell as a beneficiary. January 1990, 3 months before the Monaco trip where Edward and Diana had been photographed together. The timeline was damningly clear. Edward and Diana had begun their affair sometime in late 1989 or early 1990. Shortly after, Victoria had been persuaded to amend her trust to include Diana as a beneficiary, probably at Diana's suggestion, framed as a touching gesture of friendship. Then Edward, Diana, and James Whitmore had begun systematically embezzling from Victoria's shipping company, knowing that Victoria would eventually discover it, and that when she did, they would need a permanent solution. Murder had been part of the plan from the beginning, but Brennan still needed evidence. The anonymous letter had mentioned transfers to Switzerland made in the week after Victoria's death. He investigated the trust's banking records and discovered that on October 23, 1991, just 4 days after Victoria's death, a transfer of £300,000 had been made from the trust to a Swiss bank account. Who authorized that transfer? Brennan asked Whitmore. Edward did. As the primary beneficiary and executor of the estate, he had temporary authority to manage the trust assets until probate was completed. Why would he transfer money to Switzerland 4 days after his wife's death? He said it was for tax planning purposes, moving assets to international accounts to minimize estate taxes. It's a common strategy. What's the account number in Switzerland? Whitmore hesitated. I don't have that information readily available. Get it, Brennan ordered. It took 3 weeks and multiple legal battles, but Brennan finally obtained the Swiss account information. The account was registered to Meridian Holdings Ltd., the same shell company that had paid Diana Hartwell £50,000. The web of conspiracy was becoming clearer. Edward had used his authority as executor to transfer Victoria's money to a shell company controlled by James Whitmore, where it could be distributed to the conspirators without detection. Brennan brought this new evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service. Surely this was enough. Proof of financial fraud conducted immediately after the murder, using the victim's own money, funneled through a shell company to the benefit of the suspects. But once again, Nigel Harrington Smith appeared with his legal arguments. The transfer was made for legitimate tax planning purposes. Meridian Holdings is a legal entity. The fact that it's incorporated offshore doesn't make it criminal, and even if the transfer was improper, which my clients deny, it doesn't prove murder. At most, you might have a case for estate fraud, but that's a civil matter, not a criminal one. The CPS lawyer agreed. Inspector, this shows financial impropriety, possibly estate fraud, but it doesn't connect directly to the murder. We still have no physical evidence that any of these 3 people poisoned Victoria. The murder itself remains unproven. Brennan wanted to scream. Every avenue he pursued led to the same conclusion. The conspirators were guilty, but they'd been clever enough to avoid leaving the kind of evidence that would stand up in court. In September 1992, nearly a year after Victoria's death, Brennan received a third anonymous letter. This one contained a single sentence. Check who bought arsenic trioxide from industrial suppliers in summer 1991. JW has a connection you haven't found. JW, James Whitmore. Brennan had already checked industrial suppliers of arsenic, focusing on suppliers in Oxfordshire and the surrounding counties. No one matching Edward's or Diana's description had purchased arsenic in the months before the murder, but perhaps he'd been looking at the wrong person. If James Whitmore had purchased the arsenic, he might have been more careful about concealing it. Brennan expanded his search nationwide, contacting every supplier of arsenic trioxide in Britain. It was tedious work, complicated by the fact that many suppliers had gone out of business or had incomplete records. In late October, he finally found something. A chemical supply company in Manchester had sold 500 grams of arsenic trioxide to a customer named J. Williamson in July 1991. The purchase had been made in person, paid for in cash, with a driver's license shown as identification. Brennan obtained a copy of the receipt and the photocopy of the driver's license the company had kept on file. The face on the license was slightly blurry, but it was recognizable as James Whitmore. The name was false, but the face was his. This was it. This was the evidence he needed. James Whitmore had purchased the arsenic 3 months before Victoria's death, using a false name, but his own face. It wasn't airtight. Whitmore could argue the license was forged, or that someone else had used his identity, but it was physical evidence connecting one of the conspirators to the murder weapon. Brennan immediately sought arrest warrants for all 3 suspects, Edward Ashford-Pembroke, Diana Hartwell, and James Whitmore, charging them with conspiracy to murder and murder. This time, the magistrate agreed. The combination of the diary entries, the Monaco photograph, the financial transfers, the trust provisions, and now the arsenic purchase created a compelling picture of conspiracy. On November 3, 1992, more than a year after Victoria's death, police arrested all 3 suspects. The arrests made national headlines. Socialite murder 3 charged, proclaimed the Times. High society scandal, aristocrat, model, and lawyer accused of conspiracy, reported the Telegraph. The tabloids were even more sensational, with the Daily Mirror running a front-page photograph of Diana Hartwell being led away in handcuffs under the headline, "Murder Among the Elite." But Nigel Harrington Smith wasn't finished. He immediately filed for bail, arguing that his clients were not flight risks, had strong ties to the community, and should be released pending trial. The bail hearing became a legal battlefield, with Harrington Smith presenting character witnesses and arguing that the evidence was weak. The judge granted bail, £10 million for Edward, $1 million for Diana, and $500,000 for Whitmore. Within 24 hours, all 3 were released from custody, free to continue their lives while awaiting trial. The trial was scheduled for June 1993, nearly 2 years after Victoria's death. Chapter 6. The Trial. The trial of Edward Ashford-Pembroke, Diana Hartwell, and James Whitmore began on June 7, 1993, at the Old Bailey in London. It was one of the most publicized criminal trials in recent British history, with media outlets around the world covering the proceedings. The prosecution was led by Sir Malcolm Hendricks QC, a veteran prosecutor known for his meticulous preparation and persuasive courtroom manner. The defense team was formidable: Nigel Harrington Smith for James Whitmore, Richard Pembroke QC for Edward Ashford-Pembroke, and Alexandra Thornton QC for Diana Hartwell. All were among the most expensive and skilled defense barristers in Britain. The jury was selected carefully, 12 people who claimed they could set aside the intense media coverage and judge the case solely on the evidence presented in court. Brennan watched them file into the jury box and wondered if any of them truly could be impartial after months of tabloid headlines. Sir Malcolm's opening statement laid out the prosecution's theory of the case with devastating clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this is a case about greed, betrayal, and murder. Victoria Ashford-Pembroke was a wealthy woman, a loving friend, and by all accounts a person who valued loyalty above all else. The three defendants sitting before you betrayed that loyalty in the most profound way possible. They stole from her. They lied to her. They carried on an adulterous affair behind her back, and when she discovered their crimes and threatened to expose them, they murdered her. He walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The embezzlement from Ashford Shipping Holdings, the Monaco photograph showing Edward and Diana's affair, the trust provisions that gave Diana £1 million, the financial transfers to Swiss accounts, and finally, the arsenic purchase by James Whitmore. The evidence will show that these three defendants conspired together over a period of years. James Whitmore, as the family's trusted solicitor, created the legal mechanisms to hide embezzled funds. Edward Ashford-Pembroke, as a company director and Victoria's husband, provided access to company finances, and Diana Hartwell, as Victoria's closest friend, provided intelligence about Victoria's activities and helped manipulate her into creating a trust that would benefit the conspirators upon her death. When Victoria began to uncover the financial irregularities in September 1991, the conspirators realized they faced exposure and prosecution, so they planned her murder. James Whitmore obtained the arsenic. Someone, we believe it was Diana Hartwell, who sat next to Victoria during the dinner, poisoned Victoria's wine glass while everyone was distracted by the meal service. And Edward Ashford-Pembroke, the grieving husband, immediately began moving money out of Victoria's estate to benefit the conspiracy. This was not a crime of passion. This was a calculated, cold-blooded murder committed for money, and the evidence will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that all three defendants are guilty. The defense opening statements were equally compelling. Richard Pembroke, defending Edward, painted his client as a grieving widower who had been destroyed by his wife's death and was now being railroaded by police desperate to solve a high-profile case. Edward Ashford-Pembroke loved his wife, Pembroke said. Yes, their marriage had its difficulties. What marriage doesn't? Yes, Edward made mistakes. He had a brief affair years ago, an affair he regretted deeply. But that doesn't make him a murderer. The prosecution wants you to believe that Edward masterminded a complex conspiracy to embezzle funds and murder his wife. But look at the evidence objectively. Where is the proof that Edward actually poisoned Victoria? Where are the witnesses who saw him put arsenic in her wine? They don't exist, because Edward didn't kill his wife. Alexandra Thornton, defending Diana, focused on the lack of physical evidence. Diana Hartwell was Victoria's best friend. They had been close since childhood. The prosecution wants you to believe that Diana conducted a years-long affair with her best friend's husband, manipulated Victoria into leaving her money, and then helped murder her. But where is the evidence? A photograph from 3 years ago showing two friends at a social event. A trust provision that Victoria freely chose to create? These things don't prove murder. They don't even prove an affair. Diana Hartwell is innocent, and the prosecution knows it. Nigel Harrington-Smith, defending James Whitmore, attacked the arsenic evidence directly. The prosecution's entire case against Mr. Whitmore rests on a blurry photocopy of a driver's license allegedly used to purchase arsenic. But the photocopy is so poor that any competent expert will tell you it could be anyone. The name on the license is false. The purchase was made in cash, leaving no paper trail. And the prosecution wants you to believe that an intelligent, educated solicitor would purchase poison using his own face? It's absurd. Someone is trying to frame James Whitmore, and the police are too eager to believe it because they need a conviction. The trial proceeded over 6 weeks, with the prosecution calling dozens of witnesses. Detective Inspector Brennan testified about his investigation, describing the obstacles he'd faced and the evidence he'd uncovered. Dr. Simon Blackwell testified about the arsenic poisoning, explaining in clinical detail how Victoria had died. Patricia Kellerman, the forensic accountant, testified about the embezzlement scheme Victoria had uncovered. Most dramatically, the prosecution presented Victoria's diary entries, reading them aloud in court. The courtroom fell silent as Sir Malcolm read Victoria's final entry. Meeting with PK next week to get concrete evidence. Then we'll confront both. If they don't make full restitution, we'll prosecute. E may go to prison. Good. The defense cross-examination was brutal and effective. Richard Pembroke attacked every piece of circumstantial evidence, pointing out that none of it directly proved murder. He brought forward character witnesses who testified that Edward had been devastated by Victoria's death, that he'd wept at her funeral, that he'd been barely functional for weeks afterward. Can you truly believe, Pembroke asked the jury during his closing argument, that a man who loved his wife enough to cry at her funeral is the same man who cold-bloodedly poisoned her? The prosecution wants you to convict based on suspicion and innuendo, but British justice requires proof, and the prosecution simply hasn't provided it. Alexandra Thornton similarly attacked the evidence against Diana. She brought forward witnesses who testified about Diana's grief, her shock, her devastation. She argued that the Monaco photograph proved nothing, except that two friends had attended a social event together 3 years before the murder. The prosecution has constructed an elaborate theory, Thornton told the jury, but theories aren't evidence. Show me the witness who saw Diana Hartwell poison Victoria's wine. You can't, because no such witness exists. Show me physical evidence that Diana obtained arsenic or had access to it. You can't, because no such evidence exists. All you have is speculation about an affair that may never have happened, and a trust provision that Victoria freely chose to create. That's not enough for conviction. Nigel Harrington-Smith brought forward a handwriting expert, who testified that the signature on the arsenic purchase receipt didn't match James Whitmore's known signature. He brought forward an image analysis expert, who testified that the photocopy of the driver's license was too degraded to make a positive identification. The prosecution asks you to believe that my client, a respected solicitor with decades of experience, would walk into a chemical supply shop, show his own face, and buy poison to murder someone, Harrington-Smith said in his closing. Does that sound reasonable to you? Or does it sound like the desperate theory of police investigators who couldn't solve this case and needed someone to blame? The prosecution's rebuttal was forceful, but couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. They had motive. They had opportunity. They had circumstantial evidence of conspiracy, but they didn't have a witness who had actually seen any of the defendants poison Victoria's wine. After 6 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on July 16, 1993. The jury deliberated for 8 days. Brennan spent those 8 days in agony, unable to eat or sleep properly, convinced that the conspirators were going to walk free despite everything he'd uncovered. On July 24th, the jury announced they had reached verdicts. The courtroom was packed with journalists, spectators, and members of both families. Edward sat impassively, his expression carefully neutral. Diana looked pale and frightened. James Whitmore kept adjusting his glasses nervously. The judge called for order and asked the jury foreman to read the verdicts. In the matter of the Crown versus Edward Ashford-Pembroke, on the charge of conspiracy to murder, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Brennan felt his stomach drop. On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. Edward closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and looked at his lawyers with an expression of profound relief. In the matter of the Crown versus Diana Hartwell, on the charge of conspiracy to murder, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. Diana began to cry, covering her face with her hands. On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant? Not guilty. In the matter of the Crown versus James Whitmore, on the charge of conspiracy to murder, how do you find the defendant? A long pause. Guilty. Whispers swept through the courtroom. James Whitmore's face went white. On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant? Another pause. Even longer. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. James Whitmore slumped in his chair, his face in his hands. His lawyer immediately began arguing for a directed verdict, claiming the evidence was insufficient, but the judge denied the motion. Edward and Diana were free. James Whitmore was convicted. It was, Brennan realized, a compromise verdict. The jury had believed there was a conspiracy, but they hadn't been convinced that all 3 defendants were equally guilty. James Whitmore, as the person who had purchased the arsenic, had been the only one they could convict with certainty. Edward and Diana, despite all the circumstantial evidence against them, had reasonable doubt on their side. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. James Whitmore was remanded into custody immediately. On August 7th, 1993, James Whitmore was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The judge's remarks were scathing. Mr. Whitmore, you were a trusted legal advisor to the Ashford-Pembroke family. You held a position of respect and responsibility. Instead, you abused that trust in the most egregious way possible. You facilitated embezzlement, you purchased poison, and you participated in the murder of an innocent woman. While I cannot comment on the jury's verdicts regarding your co-defendants, I can say with certainty that your role in this crime was central and calculating. You will spend the rest of your productive life in prison, and you will have ample time to reflect on the consequences of your greed. James Whitmore was led away to begin his sentence. He never spoke publicly about the case, never implicated Edward or Diana, never tried to reduce his sentence by cooperating with authorities. Edward and Diana, meanwhile, were free. They maintained their innocence in carefully worded statements to the press. Edward said he was devastated by Victoria's death and grateful that justice has recognized I had no part in this terrible crime. Diana said she was heartbroken that anyone could believe I would harm my dearest friend and looked forward to rebuilding my life after this nightmare. Within 6 months, Edward and Diana were seen together publicly at a charity function. Within a year, Diana had divorced Richard Hartwell, citing irreconcilable differences. Within 18 months, Edward and Diana were married in a quiet ceremony in the south of France. The public reaction was one of outrage and disgust. The tabloids called it the most shameless display of contempt for justice and published photographs of the smiling couple with headlines like "Murder Pays." But there was nothing the authorities could do. They'd been acquitted, and double jeopardy meant they could never be tried again for Victoria's murder, no matter what new evidence emerged. Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan watched all of this with a mixture of rage and helplessness. He had dedicated nearly 2 years of his life to this case, had uncovered a conspiracy, had brought it to trial, and 2 of the 3 guilty parties had walked free. He never learned who had sent the anonymous letters that had helped break the case. He suspected it might have been someone in James Whitmore's office, perhaps a paralegal or secretary who had seen documents they weren't supposed to see and had a conscience. But the sender never came forward, and Brennan never found them. The case of Victoria Ashford-Pembroke's murder became infamous in British legal circles as an example of how wealth and privilege could subvert justice. Law professors used it in their classes to discuss the challenges of prosecuting circumstantial evidence cases. Journalists wrote books about it, each trying to uncover new details or prove theories about what had really happened that night at Hartfield Estate. But for Brennan, it was simply a failure, the case that got away, the one where the villains won, because they had better lawyers and more money than the victim had justice. Epilogue. 20 years later, in October 2011, exactly 20 years after Victoria Ashford-Pembroke's murder, Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan, now retired from Thames Valley Police, received an unexpected phone call. It was from a solicitor in London named Patricia Morrison, who said she was handling the estate of James Whitmore. Whitmore had died in prison 3 weeks earlier, at the age of 78, from complications of pneumonia. "Mr. Whitmore left specific instructions regarding you," Morrison said. "He wanted you to have certain documents after his death. I'm sending them by courier. They should arrive tomorrow." The package arrived as promised. Inside was a thick envelope containing a handwritten letter and a flash drive. The letter read, "Detective Inspector Brennan, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and I can finally tell the truth without fear of reprisal. You were right about everything. Edward, Diana, and I conspired to embezzle from Victoria's company starting in 1988. The affair between Edward and Diana began in late 1989. When Victoria started investigating the financial irregularities in September 1991, we knew we had limited time before she exposed us. I purchased the arsenic in July 1991 under a false name. Diana Hartwell poisoned Victoria's wine during the dinner on October 19th. She had access as Victoria's closest friend, sitting right beside her. While everyone was focused on the servers and the meal, Diana slipped the arsenic into Victoria's glass during a moment when Victoria was turned away, speaking to the MP on her other side. No one saw it, because no one was looking. Why would they suspect Victoria's best friend? Edward's role was to provide the means, access to the company finances, and to manage the aftermath. He removed all of Victoria's evidence from her office and safety deposit box before police could find it. He transferred money to Switzerland immediately after her death, as you discovered. He played the grieving husband perfectly because he is at heart a talented actor. We thought we'd gotten away with it, and in a sense we did. Edward and Diana married and lived well on Victoria's money. They're still together as I write this, still free, still protected by the acquittals they purchased with expensive lawyers. I went to prison because I was the only one the jury could definitively link to the murder weapon. I accepted my fate. In truth, prison was easier than living with what we'd done. I couldn't look at my reflection without seeing Victoria's face, the confusion and pain in her eyes when she realized she'd been poisoned, when she understood that someone at her own table had murdered her. I sent you those anonymous letters during the investigation. I wanted you to solve it, even though I knew it would likely result in my conviction. I couldn't live with the guilt of letting it go unpunished, but I was too cowardly to come forward directly, so I sent clues, and hoped you would follow them. The flash drive contains all the evidence you never found. Complete financial records showing the embezzlement scheme, emails between Edward, Diana, and myself planning the murder, photographs of Edward and Diana together over the years of their affair, bank records showing how we distributed the embezzled funds, everything you needed to convict us all. I kept these records as insurance initially, in case Edward and Diana tried to betray me. After my conviction, I kept them because I hoped that someday, somehow, the full truth would come out. British law prevents Edward and Diana from being tried again for murder, but perhaps these records will at least let the world know what they did. Perhaps Victoria's memory will be vindicated. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to confess during the trial. I'm sorry you had to work so hard to prove what happened, only to see 2 of the guilty walk free. I'm sorry that Victoria died because of our greed. Most of all, I'm sorry that justice failed her so completely. James Whitmore, July 2011. Brennan sat in his study, reading the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. Then he inserted the flash drive into his computer. Everything Whitmore had promised was there. Spreadsheets detailing the embezzlement, showing exactly how £1.8 million had been stolen from Ashford Shipping Holdings over 5 years. Email exchanges between the 3 conspirators, including one from August 1991 where Diana wrote, "If V doesn't stop investigating, we'll have no choice. I've researched methods. Arsenic is reliable and mimics natural symptoms if dosed carefully. No one suspects a wife's best friend." There were photographs of Edward and Diana together, taken over years, not just Monaco but dozens of other locations, hotel receipts, love letters, evidence of a sustained, passionate affair conducted entirely behind Victoria's back. And there were bank records showing the distribution of funds after Victoria's death. Edward had received approximately £4 million through the trust. Diana had received her £1 million bequest, plus another £2 million transferred through shell companies. James Whitmore had received £500,000 for his role, £7.5 million total, almost exactly the amount Victoria had been worth. Brennan stared at the evidence on his screen and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly. Everything he'd believed about the conspiracy was proven true. Anger that this evidence had existed all along, but had been hidden, and deep sadness that it didn't matter anymore. Edward and Diana could never be prosecuted again. The law that protected innocent people from being tried twice for the same crime also protected the guilty. But Brennan could still do something. He contacted a journalist he trusted, a woman named Helen Crawford, who had covered the original trial and had written a book about the case. He gave her copies of everything: Whitmore's letter, the financial records, the emails, the photographs. Helen's book, The Victoria Ashford-Pembroke Murder: The Full Truth, was published in March 2012. It became an immediate bestseller, spending 18 weeks on the Sunday Times bestseller list. The book laid out, in meticulous detail, every aspect of the conspiracy that had led to Victoria's murder. The public reaction was explosive. Edward Ashford-Pembroke and Diana Hartwell Ashford-Pembroke, they had taken Victoria's surname as well as her money, were vilified in the press. Photographs of them shopping in Mayfair or dining at exclusive restaurants were published alongside headlines like "Living Well on Murder Money" and "The Killers Who Got Away with It." Several charities that had accepted donations from the couple returned the money, stating they couldn't accept funds tainted by murder. Edward resigned from the boards of several companies under pressure. Diana was disinvited from social events. Their friends, those who remained, distanced themselves publicly. But they couldn't be prosecuted. They couldn't be arrested. They couldn't be punished by the legal system. Double jeopardy protected them absolutely. In June 2012, Diana Hartwell Ashford-Pembroke was found dead in the swimming pool of their Chelsea townhouse. The inquest ruled it an accidental drowning, though there were rumors of suicide. She was 49 years old. Some saw it as poetic justice. Others saw it as tragic waste. Brennan saw it as the inevitable consequence of living with unbearable guilt. Edward survived her by 11 years. He became increasingly reclusive, rarely appearing in public, living alone in the Hartfield estate that had once belonged to his family and where Victoria had died. He died of a heart attack in February 2023 at the age of 74. Neither Edward nor Diana ever publicly admitted their guilt, even after Whitmore's evidence was published. They maintained their innocence to the end, though no one believed them. The Ashford-Pembroke fortune, what remained of it after legal fees, settlements with Victoria's relatives, and 2 decades of expensive living, was divided among various distant relatives. Hartfield Estate was sold and converted into a boutique hotel. The shipping company was sold to an international conglomerate. Victoria's grave in the family plot at a church in Oxfordshire became something of a shrine. People left flowers there, particularly on the anniversary of her death. A small memorial plaque was installed in 2013, paid for by donations from strangers who had been moved by her story. It read, Victoria Ashford-Pembroke, 1959-1991. Betrayed by those she trusted most. Made justice delayed not mean justice forever denied. Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan visited that grave once, in October 2015, on the 24th anniversary of Victoria's murder. He stood there for a long time, looking at the marble headstone with its simple inscription and the flowers left by strangers. "I'm sorry I couldn't get them all convicted," he said quietly to the grave, "but I hope you know that I tried. I hope you know that the truth did come out eventually, and I hope you found peace." He never returned to the grave after that. He'd done what he could. The case had defined his career, frustrated him, aged him, and ultimately taught him that justice and the legal system were not always the same thing. Brennan died in his sleep in March 2024 at the age of 81. His obituary in the Times mentioned several cases he'd solved during his career, but it was the Ashford-Pembroke case that dominated the article. The detective who proved the crime but couldn't convict the criminals. The headline read, "The case remains, to this day, one of the most controversial in British legal history. Law schools still study it. Documentaries are still made about it. Podcasts still dissect every detail of the investigation and trial. But for those who knew Victoria Ashford-Pembroke, her family, the few genuine friends she'd had, the case is simpler than all that legal complexity. A woman was murdered by people she loved and trusted. They killed her for money. They got away with it because they were wealthy enough to hire lawyers who could exploit the limitations of the justice system. 2 of the 3 conspirators died without ever spending a day in prison for their crime. The third spent 22 years imprisoned, but took his final secrets to the grave, revealing the truth only when it could no longer result in prosecution. And Victoria? Victoria Ashford-Pembroke lies in a quiet churchyard in Oxfordshire, surrounded by the countryside she loved. Her story a cautionary tale about trust, betrayal, and the price of wealth. The mansion where she died still stands. Its elegant rooms now filled with tourists who pay to stay in the place where one of England's most infamous murders occurred. The rain still falls softly on Hartfield Estate in October, just as it did on the night of the party in 1991. The Georgian windows still gleam in the twilight. The gardens are still maintained immaculately, but the ghosts remain. The ghost of a beautiful woman in an emerald gown, poisoned at her own table by her own best friend. The ghost of justice deferred and denied. The ghost of a detective who solved a murder but couldn't punish the murderers. Some say that on October 19th each year, if you walk through the halls of what is now the Hartfield Estate Hotel, you can feel a chill in the air, a sense of profound sadness and injustice. The staff won't talk about it officially, but privately they admit that guests in the room that was once Victoria's bedroom sometimes report feeling watched, sometimes hear soft crying in the night. Whether that's true, or simply the power of suggestion fed by a famous tragedy, the fact remains, Victoria Ashford-Pembroke was murdered in that house, by people who should have protected her, for reasons as old as human nature, greed, lust, and the willingness to kill rather than face consequences. Her murder shocked British high society. The trial captivated the nation. The outcome demonstrated the uncomfortable truth that wealth can buy many things, including freedom from justice, but it couldn't buy peace for the murderers. Diana died young, possibly by her own hand. Edward died alone and despised. James Whitmore died in prison, carrying guilt that poisoned him more thoroughly than the arsenic he'd purchased to poison Victoria. In the end, perhaps there was justice after all, not the clean, satisfying justice of the courtroom, but the slower, crueler justice of conscience and consequence. The guilty were punished, just not by the system designed to punish them. Victoria Ashford-Pembroke's story endures as a reminder that evil exists even in the most privileged circles, that friendship can mask betrayal, that love can hide murder. It endures as a testament to one detective's determination to find truth, even when the system wouldn't deliver justice. And it endures as a warning that the price of greed is paid not just in prison cells, but in haunted memories, destroyed relationships, and lives poisoned by guilt. The case file remains officially open with Thames Valley Police, though no active investigation continues. In the archives, stored in a box labeled Ashford-Pembroke, Victoria, Murder 1991, Unsolved, 2 suspects acquitted, 1 convicted, sits everything Detective Inspector Thomas Brennan compiled over 2 years of investigation. Future detectives sometimes pull the file, reading through the evidence, marveling at the complexity of the conspiracy and the frustration of the near-miss conviction. They use it as a teaching tool, a reminder that sometimes the guilty go free and that perfect justice exists only in theory, not in practice. But the file also contains one other thing, a small notation added by Brennan himself in his final days with the police, just before his retirement. It reads simply, "The truth matters, even when the verdict doesn't. Victoria deserved better. I hope history remembers that." History has remembered. Victoria Ashford-Pembroke's name is no longer just that of a murdered socialite. It's become a symbol of the vulnerability of trust, of the limits of law, of the persistence of truth even in the face of injustice. And on quiet October evenings, when the rain falls softly on Oxfordshire and the lights glow in the windows of Hartfield Estate, perhaps somewhere Victoria's spirit finds a measure of comfort in knowing that while justice failed her in the courtroom, it found her in history's judgment. The killers have been named, their crime has been exposed, their reputations have been destroyed. It's not the ending the law should have provided, but it's the ending the truth demanded. And in the final accounting, truth endures longer than any legal verdict.